The thing I want to say at the start of my speech is that POI me straight away with what their comparative is, I'll accept them, because it's very hard to give a comparative PM speech when I don't know what is true in opposition's world, which is why I'm kind of stuck. But waiting on that, I have 2 main points. I'm going to talk about, firstly, why this is morally legitimate and why this is the best moral world that we could possibly conceptualize. Second of all, look at outcomes. Given that Enting said in the chat, we can assume that people know that this karmic reincarnation exists, and I think there's lots of good impacts which flow from that. First of all, I want to deal with what I think might become significant in this debate, which is obviously if karmic reincarnation exists, some kind of objective system of morality must exist by which karmic reincarnation is judged, right? Because there has to be objective criteria to be able to determine who is good and who is bad. Firstly, I think in opening government, we'd actually be perfectly happy to die on the hill of consequentialism and buying, like, getting more well-being to more people. But I actually don't think we have to do that, right? For this reason, which is my first argument, which is that there's an inherent self-correction mechanism in the moral system which comes to dominate humanity under a system of karmic reincarnation. Why is this? Because the people who, regardless of what the moral system is and what objective morality is, the people who do badly according to that criteria get reincarnated into a position which affords them minimal capacity to do any damage in the world, right? So this is like, if you're a bad person, by whatever standard that morality is, you get reincarnated to become an insect, so you have no power. If you understand the good conception of morality, then you probably get reincarnated to become a very powerful, privileged person who can do whatever. Of course, the actions that you take can then be reversed through systems of karma, but I think given that our moral systems are much more about intuition and instinct, as opposed to something that we like learn or rationalize, this is the thing which is most likely to trickle down with you, given your different lives and your the different lives within your reincarnation. Do you have a POI? Are you going to tell me? Cia, would you like to tell me what your comparison is?
POI is from sorry.
Okay.
Don't you think it's better if there is no reincarnation whatsoever and every single time it's random where you're born and your essence is not...
Brilliant. Okay, if I know that you're standing behind randomness, that's fine. I just needed to know that. Okay, but I think what I'm saying about the self-correction mechanism is that, yeah, so then moral people, the people who judge morality in a way which is closest to real morality and perfect morality, which I assume is what does best for people, but I can't adjudicate that, Op can't adjudicate that, the judges can't adjudicate that, become the people who are in positions of power. So there's an inherent self-correcting mechanism in reincarnation by which the most moral people, not in their actions, by the criteria through which they assess morality, are most likely to become the privileged and powerful, and hence that cycle corrects itself. So I think that's important, and that's how we sidestep this issue of objective morality and actually co-opt it for our side, because whatever it is, we can ensure that it happens. That being said, let's talk about what's legitimate. So I think, I'm glad O said this, because I think the comparative is that your place in the material world is determined by the birth lottery, it's determined by randomness, it's incredibly arbitrary where you're born and what kind of life you're born into. Given that people will always be born into situations which are like one another, which are horrible, and critically, given they never consented to be born and there's a random harm imposed on you, that is incredibly harmful. I'm glad Opening Up said this, because in OG, we don't have to prove that karmic reincarnation is perfect morally, we just have to prove it's comparatively better than randomness, which I think we can win on and which is easy to do. This is important. Firstly, randomness is bad because, one, there's no opt-out, you're literally trapped. Whereas there's karma, even if you've coerced into being a bad person, because I accept both opposition, I presume, are going to make the arguments that you're pushed to being a bad person because of certain factors beyond your control. But even in that case, you can always redeem yourself in the next lifetime, right? Because that is symmetric, given that you can randomly have like a moral harm imposed on you. At least if you have a moral harm imposed on you which you were coerced into, the fact that you can definitely escape from that if you change your mind and decide to be more moral in the future is important, because we recognize that moral agency and moral autonomy is something that evolves. So people should have the capacity to evolve with them, because you need to have the agency to break the cycle. That's something you don't get on the comparative, where you're stuck into randomness and everyone is a randomness, because just playing odds, some people are just always going to have terrible lives of suffering. That's incredibly unfair. At least having them the capacity to mitigate that is incredibly moral, in the sense that it values human agency. I think that human agency is a massively important thing, because it's part of like your personhood and part of what makes you a moral being. But critically, the chance for redemption is important, and this is why you need karmic reincarnation to have this, because it is a supernatural force, which means it's not about your capacity to do good, it's critically about your intentions and how you operate within your set capacities, right? Because karmic justice is a principle that sees beyond just how much money you can donate, because it's about your intentions and how you act within constraints. This is unique to any other kind of reward system, right? Because note, heaven or hell have no chance of redemption, and I think therefore, given you have time to develop over different lifespans, that's incredibly unfair. Any kind of benefit in the material world is always informed by how much privilege you have, and therefore how much good you can do in a consequential way, because it's defined by your privilege and by your capacities. The comparative is reincarnation, where it's, because it's judged holistically and in a kind of metaphysical sense, everyone can access that in a way which is not true on the comparative. That's particularly important. I think the last thing I want to say in this principle, which is unique about karmic reincarnation, is that this is something which means there's a soul inherent in everything, right? Because even conceptions of heaven and hell pits Christians against Muslims. Even conceptions of benefits in the material world pits animals against humans, because it all takes place in certain hierarchies to which some groups have access and to which some groups value and to which some groups don't. The comparative is literally all souls in the world have equal capacity to become something which is incredibly valuable, which means you ascribe them that kind of status. That's important. I think that's important, given that it's outside of our epistemic constraints in this debate to be able to adjudicate which groups are more valuable than others. Karmic reincarnation is the ultimate equalizing factor which creates that. This is particularly important given if everyone knows karmic reincarnation exists and we believe human souls are equal souls are in every being and have the capacity to be something, so we're likely to treat everyone significantly better because we recognize that they can be regimed, and we recognize that the common denominating factor of being that soul and having those certain qualities is something we all share as a common good in our humanity. Theo, would you like to give me a POI? No, you wouldn't. That's a shame. Okay, so in terms of outcomes, I think the first massive thing to say is that you're obviously, if you know that you can be redeemed, you always have the capacity to change. You always have a drive to do so, right? Because critically, right now, it's the wealthy and the powerful who don't face any punishment, like in the material world. So this is an insufficient mechanism, but karmic redress affects everyone equally, and it's critically a motivating factor because a whole lifespan is like a massive significant factor, which is like the scope of the consequences you're facing are massive. But critically, if you're pushed into making mistakes and doing bad things, you're not trapped into that forever, like heaven and hell, which I think is immoral, given that like you can't escape it and everyone should have a chance for redemption because we believe in second chances. But I think the biggest outcome in this debate is that this is for the first time ever, all moral concern expands to every sentient being ever, because we don't operate on this like human-centric conception of these hierarchies that we built. This is including different species, by the way, different like hierarchies that we built or different power structures that we built, and that we know based on our experiences, because you recognize that every soul has the capacity to be deemed and operates within the same moral system. I think this massively changes the way that we do in the world, because you want to encourage people to be moral, because hypothetically it's not impossible that everyone is born into a privileged position or everyone becomes like successful, because we don't have to have all the animals that like live terrible lives and get stamped on. So I think this is just a massive equalizing force on the comparative when you believe that people either own their choices or are there because of randomness, and therefore there's no moral salience to that claim. When you recognize that people can climb up like the moral ladder and be able to access these kind of frameworks, that is massively beneficial. But the most important thing is probably having a self-correction mechanism for perfect morality on our side. That's a pretty big win. Opening government.
I thank the Prime Minister, and I'm happy to call upon the Leader of Opposition.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, perfect. That's what I was waiting for. Let me put out my notes. Okay, timer. All right. 3, 2, 1. In opening opposition, we're going to bring you a quite straightforward case. We're going to prove two things. First of all, that being virtuous or being moral is a luxury that many people don't have, and that therefore making them suffer for lifetimes and suffering worse for lifetimes is incredibly bad. Second of all, we'll talk about why people will treat poor people and also animals too badly under that system, and that is more believable than the idea of government, which simply says morality is some intuition. These people are just fundamentally moral, and therefore the world will be a happier place. My responses will to a large degree or will all be integrated within my own material. So let's delve into this first argument about being virtuous and that being a luxury that many people don't have. We think this system of karmic reincarnation screws over a lot of people significantly more harmfully, which is fundamentally unfair. Because note, the punishment for being immoral is incredibly severe. Life in dire poverty really sucks. it can be really terrible. You have no rights, you have no autonomy. You're hungry, like your stomach hurts, like that is the kind of life. And those are even not the people who are worst off, right? Life as an insect suffers. Life as an insect sucks even more. People step on you, all that kind of stuff. We think having a world where people suffer for lifetimes on end because of being immoral is terrible. The reason for that, and the reason why we think it is not a fair correction system, is because morality is something that is fundamentally dependent on your circumstances in three different ways. First of all, there's some notion of moral intuition that opening government wants to talk about. But note that whether you have that notion or not is something which is, at the end of the day, fully random, something you are born with. Second of all, we think there are other things that play a role. For example, the intelligence that you have, which to some extent plays a role in understanding moral circumstances and developing deeper thoughts about what morality is or not and how to be moral in more complex moral situations. And third of all, we think very obviously wealth and autonomy and positions of power. First of all, being moral is a luxury, right? Because very often people don't have the option of being moral because they have to prioritize other needs that they have in their life, for example, survival, over whether they're being morally virtuous. Second of all, having the time to think about it, to talk to others about it, to read about it. These are all things that come with wealth. Third of all, having a level of power, of autonomy, which means you can do more moral good within the world. Those are things that are dependent on wealth. Why is that argument then important in this debate? Because first of all, note that therefore the system of opening government is not better than random. It is something that is predetermined and something that is fundamentally unfair. However, they have significantly more negative impact because they have those same people that don't need those circumstances, that don't have that moral intuition, that don't have that intelligence, or that don't have that wealth, suffering worse and worse for infinite lifetimes. We think that is something that is incredibly terrible. We would say either a world without reincarnation, but also a world with reincarnation, but that reincarnation is completely random, would not have that moral harm in the first place, because you wouldn't have those same people suffering worse and worse during different lifetimes because they don't have those first needs in the first place, which are needed to climb up within that system. And that is the second part of that problem that I want to stress here, that this system is in itself self-reinforcing. Opening government tries to claim that it is self-correcting, but they don't really give a lot of analysis why that's the case. What we say is, because of my explanation of what affects morality, as you get worse off throughout the system, it becomes more difficult for you to become moral. You don't have the wealth in the first place. At the moment you're an insect, how are you going to be moral in the first place? I have literally no fucking idea. And the problem is that it's zero sum. So it's not just to the downside, but it's also to the upside, because ultimately where you reincarnate is a result of where you stand in the moral order of all beings, right? Which means that at the moment for people at the top, it becomes easier and easier to become moral. That also means that for you, it becomes more difficult to climb up those ranks. Given that, we think the system is self-reinforcing, damning people to lifetimes of eternal suffering, and that is something that is fundamentally unfair and something we don't want to support. The second argument that I'm going to talk about is why you will create a society that will treat poor people badly still, and that will lead to problems there. Note, obviously, the clear result of karmic reincarnation is that people who are worse off deserve this. That means that these people often aren't helped by others in society in positions of power, because first of all, they believe these people are bad people that shouldn't be helped, which means, and this is important, that giving them autonomy or any form of power or something like that is a morally bad act to do, because these people are bad people that at the moment you give them power will create harm within the world. Which means that this is a moral belief underlying this, that their essence is bad, and therefore they should be kept small in order to prevent them from being able to do harm within the rest of the world. Note that is also the world and the moral intuition that opening government supports, right, and thinks is good, because they think some people should be in power because they are good, but therefore they also have to support keeping bad people out of power, keeping them away from autonomy, having any say in this world, because that would be bad. Then they might say, yeah, but moral people would be in positions of power and not do this, not increase the amount of suffering in the world. First of all, it is completely unclear why that is the morally right outcome that they're saying, right? Which we think is under their own framework of sort of absolute morality existing. What we say is it will lead to more suffering. That is something that is probably really bad. But second of all, what we say is people don't know what morally bad behavior exactly is, especially on these hard questions. They know they reincarnated, but they don't know why. And they don't know which things were good and bad about their own moral beliefs. The problem is that, first of all, people are likely to think that treating people badly is what's moral. And second of all, morality is a learned and collective concept, which means that people thinking about it in the world of government are the ones who are deciding and believing, and those are all people not in those circumstances in the first place. That means we think that is a world with ultimately more suffering than a world without this concept altogether. Panel incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition, and I'm happy to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Just one sec. Opening opposition can't only forward a negative case against our motion, but must also forward a positive case for the birth lottery. In the absence of that, the best they've done is mitigation, which means we're still winning this debate. The first claim I'm going to take out from opening opposition is the idea that this punishment is very severe. Panel, note that the motion literally says fucking moral degeneration. Even a poor person in Sudan doesn't have to go around killing people. This is the sort of bar that we're looking for. It's unclear to me why moral degeneration is a poor thing and everything else is a rich thing. Should have read the motion. Number two, contrast this with the fact that how every single rich person escapes secular justice. Think of the jail system and how Harvey Weinstein has escaped secular justice. Think of every single priest who has assaulted a child and escaped secular justice. Secular justice does not work, panel. We need to give them a punishment that they are aware of, and a punishment that will carry forward into the next lifetime, because we as human beings have not constructed a system of punishment which works for these terrible people. Number three, I just want to point out the point at which you think the punishment is so severe and you might be an animal, you start caring for animals. There is a reason that most Hindus are vegetarian. It's because they know that the soul can depart the canvas of the human and go into an insect or an animal. If anything, what this means is that for the reasons that opening opposition has given, you treat animals better because you want the punishment to be less severe. You want to live in a world where there isn't a massive difference between being a human and a cow. And the way that you do that is by achieving more equality between human beings and animals. Number four, I just want to point this out. If the punishment is so severe, why do you demonize the poor? Because both of those things can't be true at the same time. On one hand, you're saying this is the most severe punishment you'll ever get on your lifetime. Also, we fuck over the poor. You probably have huge sympathies for the poor because you know that they're going through a terrible punishment that you aren't. This is the attitude that we have towards them. The logical extension of punishment being severe is greater sympathy for the poor, not less. Let's deal with the second claim. And I think this takes out CO because it'll make an annoying philosophy argument. Hate those guys. Let's talk about free will. Let's assume that you have no control over your actions. And opening opposition sort of hinted at this. I'll take you later, guys. Let's say that you have no control over your actions. Your luck decides everything. Let's just say that you're born, atoms, molecules, all of that bullshit that they will talk about. I say on the comparative, even with zero free will, we're still better off because you are counterpropping one lifetime. Even in the arbitrary universe of human experience, where arbitrary actions outside of my control lead to me being a billionaire versus an insect, I still get to experience being a billionaire in one lifetime. In their world, I only stay a shit poor person, which is the majority of the world's experience on planet Earth in status quo. So even in a world where I have no control over my actions, at least in an infinite series of lifetimes, I get a lot more utility out than anything that they do. The third thing that I want to talk about then is the birth lottery. Again, something that CEO will be tethered to. I want to make 3 comments here. The first comment I want to make is on consent. I say that any system of fairness must necessarily involve consent. Now, you might very well ask, consent is symmetric because on both sides you don't choose to be born. That's very well true, but you can choose where you are born in the next lifetime. This is crucial, panel, because we are the only side in this debate which protects your consent insofar as you are meaningfully consenting to the consequences of your actions in this lifetime, insofar as that decides what your next lifetime is going to be like. So the birth lottery is significantly worse because you never consent to be born as who you are born and where you are born. At least we get to decide that for our next lifetime, if not our initial lifetime. Number 2, fairness and justice. I've already talked about how the most powerful people in our society always escape secular justice. So even in the world where we send some more poor people in our world towards the gallows, you have 0 rich people in their world going towards the gallows. I think that's really important insofar as the birth lottery is concerned. But the third thing I say about the birth lottery is the idea of well-being. I think well-being is a commodity and well-being is limited. Not everyone can be happy all the time for the reasons and the systems that we've inherited from our past generations. This means that well-being should be divided and allocated in the most moral way possible. So if only a few people every generation can be happy, we don't think that should be decided randomly, but that should be decided in a meritocratic manner. So if well-being is indeed limited and not everyone can be happy at all times, the people given the best chance to maximize their well-beings are people who deserve it. That is what we're arguing. Now I'm going to discuss political outcomes in our debate, having taken out the birth lottery. Before I do that, closing opposition, please give me something to work with.
Yep. So are you saying, to be clear, that universal morality is whatever most human beings agree that it is?
Yes, no, maybe you can make an argument on moral relativism. Let's talk about political outcomes. I have 3 things to say here. Number 1, I think it's really important to understand that power should be scaled with how much moral action you commit. Let me explain what that means. If you save 10 people, you should get $1 million, in my opinion. What happens in status quo is that charities get the shittiest incomes, the shittiest recognition, and Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and all of these fuckers get all the recognition. It's because we have something which is called tainted altruism, that we expect altruistic people to be least rewarded because they are altruistic, because otherwise it wouldn't seem altruistic. We want a society where people who contribute the most are elevated to positions of highest power. For instance, if you kill someone, let's take away the capacity for you to kill someone. Let's make you an insect. If you save someone, let's give you more capacity to save someone. Let's make you a billionaire. So the way that we leverage is to give people the best possible positions for the actions that they are doing, whether they are moral or immoral. But secondly, and much more importantly, power is also a commodity. Not everyone can be president. Not everyone can be a billionaire. Not everyone can be the head of the household. In our world, we decide power in the most meritocratic way because our decisions of power are fundamentally moralistic. The person who expounds the best possible consequences is the person who gets most power in our society. And the person who expounds the most worst consequences gets the least power in our society. This means that we leverage the interests of those who are most moral over the interests of those who are not. But finally, I say, what about those people who get caught in this negative feedback loop? They keep getting shit lifetimes, etc., etc. One, I just want to point out that this is literally not how karmic reincarnation works. So if you do bad things, you become an insect, but an insect can't will morality. So you naturally become a human being in your 3rd lifetime. It's a limited punishment because an insect can't pursue social justice or the Me Too movement. So realistically speaking, they have to become humans at some point. But number 2, you are always given a chance of redemption. In the birth lottery, the biggest regret everyone watching this debate and speaking this debate will have is that we couldn't do enough good, we couldn't do enough bad. Panel, we give you a second chance at redeeming your moral soul. We're very, very proud to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister, and I'm happy to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Can everyone hear me?
Faintly, because there is a background noise. Can you try again?
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Okay, 3, 2, 1, Karmic reincarnation means that the people who are in power can decide on what morality is and then are then legitimized, because by being born into power, you are seen as a moral authority and someone that should be able to define ethics. I think that is extremely problematic. I think what opening government fails to recognize is that the distribution of wealth and the distribution of well-being is important. It is not a zero-sum game, and it is something that we can decrease the amount of people that are suffering, therefore decreasing or increasing the number of utility that we get. Okay, what I'm going to talk about today is how do we decide on morals and who is able to create the narrative on morals. But firstly, a couple of points of extraneous rebuttal. Okay. Opening up government says there's secular justice, which doesn't work. Two responses. One, I think increasingly it does work. I think it's extremely unnuanced to say rich people never get punished. I think that there is a huge improvement in justice in society because more and more people are able to engage with society and are able to hold powerful people to account through social media or banding together, information getting out and transparency increasing. Two, I think what they assume is that karmic justice is right. I think a lot of the victims and the essence of these victims aren't going to see the way this karmic justice is carried out and therefore aren't going to feel retribution and aren't going to feel happy because the people who perpetuated violence against them are being punished. Under their side of the house, it's more likely that we're waiting for this divine intervention where we get karmic justice, but the essences of the people that are being screwed over never feel that, right? I think a lot of those people will benefit more, which means that the suffering of injustice will be less under our side of the house. Then they talk about infinite lives and therefore at some point you can be a millionaire, at some point you're going to be an insect. I think at best that means there is a neutral utility of this plan because you have great lives and you have really bad lives. Given the fact that the majority of people currently being born do live in poverty, I don't think that infinite lives means a net positive in utility. But two, I think under their side it is static, as I'm going to explain later, which means that the suffering in the world and the utility in the world is always going to go back to zero. I think compared to the reference point. I think under our side, we're able to improve the amount, the situation of people who are suffering, which makes it less likely people are born into suffering, which means that the net utility of the suffering improves. Then OG said, onto our principle. What David tells you is that given the fact that some people live in very constrained situations and they have to focus on being able to live themselves and survive, we think it's legitimate for them to prioritize their own well-being over the well-being of others. We think that's something that is legitimate and people shouldn't be punished for that. Opening government then says, well, morality is relative. If you have small means, you have to do small things to get out. One, I think that doesn't deal with the principle of David, the fact that it's self-defense in order to prioritize yourself. Even though you might be able to do so, we think it's legitimate for those people to spend the majority of their time thinking about how they're going to survive if that is unclear. But two, I think very often it is a comparative. I think it's easier to be virtuous, which means it's easier to be virtuous under their side of the house. And therefore richer people, people in privilege are going to have an easier time anyway. I think, so I think that very often it is better if your essence actually is dissolving and your essence is then nothing. And maybe that's a weird euthanasia case from opening opposition from the Netherlands. But I think continued suffering is worse than suffering for a small period of time, given the fact that people are in a long list of suffering. I think that's bad. Then lastly, they talk about just like a general birth lottery idea. I think in the status quo, very often now you can believe it's at least not your fault that you're suffering. I think a lot of the people that are born into suffering are going to be continuously feel sorry, like feel responsible for their own suffering. I think that makes their suffering worse. Okay, the type of morality in the world. What opening government talks about is self-correction. Those who are good are born into power and their essence will carry on their morality. I think that assumes that the essence of someone is stable and the essence of someone is moral. I think that is unlikely for a couple of reasons. One, I think you're limited by the physical body of a person. That means you're very unable to continue to think of all information and to continue to bring that information forward. I think specifically given that ethics means that you have to make very specific, messy decisions, right? Which aren't the same over generations, which aren't the same over situations. I think it's very unlikely people are going to have a rule or like a necessary rule book of what essence is. I think every single new generation, you're born into a new situation, which you're then brought up into, where you learn new things, where your education and your biases form you. Why do we think that people who are born into privilege are very likely to have bad morals and are very unlikely to be challenged. One, I think people born in immorality, or like people born in poverty, are seen as immoral and are therefore seen as people who are not legitimately making claims towards morality. That means at best they're dependent on rich people thinking, maybe I'll share some of my money. But we think very unlikely that these people are going to be put into positions of power because they're seen as bad. Note, we have a comparative, and that comparative is a birth lottery. And that comparative works a lot better. Why? Because I think that this means that people are seen as having bad luck when they're born into a position of bad power. It means that you can think, look, what would have happened to me as an individual when I would have been born in this different situation? That's the reason why when you teach like first years about the view of ignorance, all of their moral issues all of a sudden seem to be solved because they can think and find a way in which they think what would be most equal. What does that mean? I think given the fact that people can now identify with people born into a bad situation more, they're more likely to actually spread out wealth and spread out well-being. That means the general well-being of the world is going to go up. Why? Because well-being and wealth very often has diminishing returns. I think that even if people in the Netherlands would be slightly less rich, I think that's going to be better if people who are suffering from hunger will have that money, right? I think that means that it's more likely to have morality. David already talks to you about why people in privilege are likely to support bad morals. One, I think people who you see, you're more likely to care about, right? What you see, and this is also like this is always true because you're limited to to your physical body, which means that the people you see about are the people you're most likely to think about. That's why you over prioritize the comfort you see from those who are privileged over the suffering of those you don't see. Two, the fact that people cannot hold the system to account because as soon as they're suffering from the system, it is legitimate that that system is making you suffer, right? There's an inherent circle in that because people cannot say I deserve better because as soon as you say that, people will not like it, right? So I think the systems of power and privilege are very unlikely to be broken because there is an inherent legitimation of that system. Under our side, as we've seen over many, many years, these systems are broken down because people think, what would have happened if you would have been born here? What makes you deserve privilege? Well, I do not. I think lastly, good and bad people have the tendency to focus on themselves. The strong narrative of the view of ignorance is currently making sure that they don't, and that bias is being broken. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think people in privilege should be told that they deserve that privilege. I think that means you should vote opposition.
I thank the deputy leader of opposition, and to open the second of the debate, I'm happy to call upon the member of government. Government, I'm happy to call upon the member of opposition.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
One of the reasons I stopped debating was admittedly a slight boredom with motions. I must admit, I am not bored now. Two broad lines of extension. Firstly, and I'll be rebutting along the way. Firstly, why this is unjust. Second, why this leads to bad outcomes. Rebuttal fully integrated. So justice. So just to be clear where the debate's at right now, opening opposition makes I think the sort of obvious claim that it is easier for privileged people to be virtuous, and that means that reincarnation will be unfair. I do think that Gov responds to this quite persuasively. OG points out it's not that hard to be virtuous. CG points out, presumably, what it means to be virtuous is relativized to your resources and what's available to you. So we're going to give you much stronger reasons why this is unjust. 3 lines of extension. 1, the argument from the discontinuity of persons. 2nd, the argument from eternal damnation. 3rdly, the argument from randomness as fairness. Firstly, the discontinuity of persons. The government claim is that this is a just system because your lot in life is allocated based on how good or bad you have been. The problem with this argument is that the person committing the action in this life and experiencing the consequences of karma in the next life are not meaningfully, morally the same person. To understand why this is true, ask yourself, why is it so important to us that we punish the correct person for a crime? So if I commit a crime, like theft, for example, why is it so important that I am the one punished for this, not, say, Tex, an innocent bystander? The reason for this is threefold. Firstly, because I am the person who has committed a crime, it is important that we correct my action by allowing me to be punished and thus to understand why it is I ought to behave better. It is important to me the reasons for that punishment are transparent to me so that I can know that the cause of my punishment was the bad action I've committed and that therefore the solution to that punishment is to stop committing the bad actions, right? It requires that psychological continuity between being aware of the initial action and being aware of the consequences of that action in terms of the punishment upon me. Note, that is not present in karmic reincarnation because your reincarnated self bears no psychological continuity to your pre-reincarnation self. They have no memories of what they've done, even if they can infer in some abstract way that maybe they're being punished for a bad thing they've done. They have no idea what specifically it was that they've done and how specifically to correct that action. Second, it is because of the importance of balancing the scales for the victims. So the reason why it's important that the same person is punished for committing a crime is that this provides catharsis for those who have been wronged by the actions of that agent. They can see that that individual is being held accountable for wronging you. But that visibility is not available to you post-reincarnation because you don't know into which body that person has been reincarnated. Again, you might know in the abstract, but it's the specific release of seeing that individual, understanding that they've wronged you, knowing, therefore, that there was an action that they ought not have committed. That is part of the critical process of that sort of release. But thirdly, it must be knowable. Like, in order for punishment to not be arbitrary, right? Like, you have to explain to me why it is I'm being punished, what I have done wrong, such that I can understand and process that experience. Otherwise, the punishment is quite literally senseless. I cannot make sense of it, which is precisely what happens under karmic reincarnation. So to be clear, because there is no psychological continuity between pre and post reincarnation and no physical continuity between pre and post reincarnation, we don't think there is a moral connection between those two people, which means that the punishment is unjust. Note, if they say, but your soul is continuous, right? That is not sufficient. It's not sufficient to prove there is a connection, right? So all the atoms in my body might, by pure chance, be constituted of the same atoms that made up Hitler's body. It does not follow I am therefore responsible for his crimes. Proving a connection is not the same as proving a morally significant connection, which is what we've broken in this argument. Second theme here, eternal damnation. So, I think like gestures at this by pointing out that you might be reincarnated as an insect, and therefore, how do you become moral? We're going to actually make the argument that you can't be moral as an insect. Firstly, like the reason why human agents are capable of moral thinking is we don't experience impulses and then act immediately upon them, right? In the way that the lower animals do. We experience an impulse, and there is some reflective space in which we ask ourselves, do I have a good enough reason to act upon that impulse. That is the space in which moral thinking occurs, where I ask myself, do I have good enough reasons? Lower animals, which don't possess that agentic space, do not have this ability to reason morally. Moreover, they don't communicate with each other with the sophistication of concepts required to have any sort of moral thinking. Moreover, so many moral concepts are predicated on ideas like personal identity, which most animals don't have by virtue of not even passing the mirror test. Notably here, that means if you are reincarnated as a lower animal, it is virtually impossible for you to make it out of there. We do have room to say this, right? The motion does not say that everyone has the equal chance of being reincarnated. It says, if you do well, then you'll be reincarnated. It doesn't say everyone can in fact do well. So being reincarnated as an insect imprisons you in that same cycle for the rest of eternity. That rebuts OG's argument about the chance for redemption. Finally, randomness is fairness. So they say randomness is unfair. I'd like to point out firstly, right, as opening of counterprop is not, you only get one life. It is reincarnation randomly. That means everyone has the same chance of experiencing all the goods and evils of the world every single time. That is fair. Two people walk into a casino. One of them emerges as a pauper, one emerges as a millionaire. That is perfectly fair because they have the same chance of emerging from the casino in that way. So you do get that same chance over and over again. Okay, let's talk about bad outcomes. I'll take a POI from OG.
The reason this is philosophically annoying is because the literal Hindu reincarnation belief is that you are conscious that you're a cow. You are conscious that you're an insect. This identity thing is like fancy, but not true.
Thank you. Like, that does not rebut any of the argument, because I said even if you know that you are an insect, you don't know the reasons for which you have been put into this position, which matters morally. Moving on. So, bad outcomes. To be clear, Prop does think, right? They do think morality, universal objective morality, is about what most people think. That's their whole argument about the self-correction mechanism. Good people get to be reborn into privilege and therefore can reshape morality. The problem is that this system destroys alternative moralities. Here's a simple illustration. In a world where assume that we are in a world where most people think homosexuality is immoral. That means all the people who believe otherwise, including people who are themselves gay, are reincarnated not as humans in the next life, but as people who are insects. That eliminates their contribution to the pool of humans who are thinking about what is moral. So you're eliminating any chance of contesting dominant moralities. So I think you preserve power structures. Whatever is the dominant morality filters out all alternative moralities by having those people reborn as insects. Finally, the idea that you have incentives to behave well. One, I think people who experience maximal hyperbolic discounting. People are bad enough about factoring in future costs themselves. Imagine when those future costs are held in the next life. But second, you're more likely to not spend your life doing good things, but spend your life contesting for your preferred morality. The reason being that you don't know what universal morality is. So it's hard for you to know which actions are just. You do know that if you persuade everyone to adopt your morality, then whatever you do is the right thing. So you don't in fact incentivize good action in that way. Finally, CG's ridiculous proselytization argument. A, atheists can be moral too. They can experience sympathy and recognize other people's rights. B, religion actually gets stronger on our side because now people don't have the availability of thinking that everything is karma. They need to look to religion for guidance. Very, very happy to stand in closing opposition.
I thank the member of opposition. I'm happy to call upon the government whip.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, just 1 second, sorry. Okay, two broad things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about culpability and intent. And secondly, I'm going to talk about our extension on religion and why, and the response that we received that was barely a response in the first place. Okay, so firstly on culpability and intent and whether people deserve to go to the right places. The first thing that I want to note in this debate is that if culpability is arbitrary, which I do believe that to some extent it is, because no team in this debate was able to prove the existence of things like free will that mean that you have that means that you have things like moral responsibility over the kinds of actions that you take. But secondly, if it is true that there is a degree of arbitrariness in terms of whether you are actually psychologically continuous with who you are after you're reborn, that is probably also the case of whether you are psychologically continuous with who you are in 10 years because your personality changes, you might have faulty memories. All of those things are equally arbitrary throughout the course of your own life, but presumably closing opposition would still punish people for a crime that they committed, even if that person had an amnesia attack in between, right? So I think that to the extent that I can concede that most things are arbitrary in this debate and that culpability and intent is probably probably not something that we want to attribute significant moral weight to. If that is the case, then closing government in this debate automatically wins, because we don't care about whether people intend to be virtuous. We don't care about whether if people who are virtuous are reborn in powerful ways or are reborn in the way that they deserve. All that we care about is that we get the kind of beneficial discussions of virtue, and we get the kind of self-reformation of how people are able to implement that virtue in their daily lives that occurs through means such as religion. Because if you are a virtuous person in your own life, then that immediately improves the quality of the lives of the people around you. If you have no moral framework by which to adjudicate this debate, because no team has given you any kind of conception of moral responsibility, then I think that the only thing that you can revert to is, do we make the quality of lives of people's better? Do they get a sense of meaning from religion and from community? And do they start contributing to things like charity? In that case, closing government is the only team that has actually presented you substantive analysis. But okay, on to closing opposition now, and I'll deal with like a bit more explicit, even though I think I've already framed large portions of their extension out of this debate. So the main link that they give you is like, look, there's a discontinuity of who you are now and who you are in the future, because you might like not in the future in your second life remember who you are in the present life. You might not even be like the same person because you have a different personality, and your experiences will be constructed based upon who you are there. So firstly, I've explained to you why this has absolutely nothing to do with our extension, why our positive material wasn't hung upon this. But secondly, I would challenge the premise that we base our decisions of culpability anyways on people being psychologically or having like continuous memories throughout the course of their lifetime, because presumably a lot of the reasons as to why we hold people culpable in the status quo is because it serves as an effective deterrence mechanism. It serves as an effective way to rehabilitate people. So if we are willing to violate people to some extent, their degree of principled rights in the status quo, in order to serve some kind of like utilitarian benefit to the rest of people and participants within that society who've done nothing wrong at all, then I think that we're happily able to extend that principle into framing our case. But secondly, note that closing opposition's case is entirely irrelevant, because the comparative that they are literally obligated to defend is randomness, and randomness is just a lot less accurate, even if they are able to prove some degree of inaccuracy to our standard of adjudicating whether people were good or bad. Because okay, let's say that you're a person who is like a pretty shit person, but you're kind of unclear about it, and then you're reborn as a cockroach. There is probably at least a greater degree of relation between you and that person who is now a cockroach versus you and just a random anything in the future, because their comparative is just you defending being a cockroach or being some other person. So if their metric is randomness anyways, then I think that randomness of culpability is equally bad as perhaps culpability being implemented in the wrong way on our side of the house. So the extent of their harm is basically meaningless when you have to factor in the comparative. But okay, now weighing our material against everything that you heard from opening half. Firstly, opening government. And I think that opening government does a good job at explaining to you why good intentions are meaningful, and reincarnation is going to provide you with some incentive to be virtuous in your everyday life. But I think that when we break this down into the framing of firstly how this affects people in their everyday actions, but secondly on culpability, I think culpability anyways is largely irrelevant in this debate, because insofar as opening government's mechanism is just that if you are a bad person, you're going to get reborn as a cockroach, and then suddenly you're going to become a good person again, but the good person has no memory of who they were as a cockroach as defined by the motion. But on top of that, they probably don't even have the ability to introspect about why they were made a cockroach in the first place, because they were a bad person. Like, I think that opening government is largely taken out of this debate when we consider that not that many people actively want to be bad people in the first place, because it just makes you feel like a really shit person regardless of the consequences that you experience in your everyday life, right? Like, I think that most people never actually assume that they themselves are actively being bad and eliciting harm onto other individuals. Most people assume that this was just the circumstances that they were placed in, and they have no other option, and they're probably making the best with what they've got. So I think that they're talking about a very small minority of individuals, even if they do hold those individuals culpable and incentivize them to have better behavior. Because I think that if we do accept what opening opposition and closing opposition are reliant upon, which is that there is some incentive for individuals to be virtuous in the status quo, then definitely what becomes the most important point in this debate is how do we get that virtuous intent to translate to virtuous action? And the only team that was able to provide you with that analysis was closing government, because we explained to you how we reform the conversations of morality that internally happen within religions, and why religions are the only ways that we are able to update what we consider to be moral and make it a lot more accurate. And so I think that, like, just to clarify, in terms of rebuilding our extension, why we think the majority of conversations about virtue have to come from religions, and why you don't get people buying into virtue on their side of the house, which is what their entire case is reliant upon, right? I think the first reason for this, and Katja already explained this, is that there is some degree of game theory in your everyday interactions with people, right? So you have an incentive when you engage in everyday conversation and in literally every interaction that you have in your life to exploit the other person or to make them feel a lot worse, because it is that self-benefit to you. And if they don't do the same thing to you, then you have now benefited from whatever interaction you've had with that person, and you've now exploited them. The problem is if everybody keeps doing this all together, then the quality of life gets a lot worse for everybody, and now it's a prisoner's dilemma. So I think that to the extent that you as an individual in your everyday life have absolutely zero incentive to want to be a good person, if you believe in a kind of materialistic conception and the actual benefits of being a virtuous person don't materialize in your everyday life, then I think that what that means is you don't get any kind of virtuous behavior on their side of the house. What that means is you need an additional metaphysical incentive that is only created by a collective organization to want to do good in the first place. And we explained to you why religion is the only ways in which people are able to do that, and why you no longer are able to recruit followers at the point at which people don't care about being virtuous, because obviously the foundation of religion is based upon this idea of a broader metaphysical virtue existing in the first place. But why is religion important? And this is all of the stuff that they need to respond to, because they didn't do it in their last speech. They just asserted that religion, like atheists, can be virtuous. I've just explained to you why there is no incentive for an atheist person who is just going to be reborn as a random new creature to ever want to be virtuous. Religion is important because we get community, we get observation, we get omniscient needs to be virtuous, and on that basis, incredibly proud to propose.
I thank the government whip. Maybe to call upon the opposition whip.
Cool. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, cool. Closing government is out of this debate for two simple reasons. One, they seem confused. In one speech, it's about weakening the structures of religion, and in the next speech, it is about strengthening religion because it is the only organization that can do certain things. But number two, it is also because it is less important than the justice and the accountability and the culpability that the GovWhip themselves spends more time attacking. That is the heartbeat of our case. What was that case? It was a case that said, it's unfair to punish someone if there isn't a relevant moral continuity. Now, let's be clear. There can always be something that's continuous. You can always say that the child was in some way continuous from the person who committed a bad act in the past. The question you need to ask yourself is, what is the relevant thing that binds them together that makes one fit and deserving of punishment? Darian suggests that that is both an understanding, reason, and the capacity for reason to understand why something happened, and the fact that victims are able to tie the punishment to the individual that committed that crime, and as a result create rehabilitation and a sense of recompense in the world. What are the responses we got to this? In opening government, there are two, I think. One is the notion of the soul, but I think Darren already asked the question of whether this is morally significant. It's not enough to just point at a difference, and they just sort of presume that because the soul has all the religious and metaphysical weight of two millennia of history, that thing is significant. It isn't, and it was something they needed to prove. The POI they gave, however, is that at least you are now conscious that you are a cow, and as a result, that consciousness is what carries on. For one, I'm just not very sure why that's the case. And CG themselves seem to kind of knife them in the back when they say that. But more importantly, I want to point out how much this weakens as Darren points out, just because you share the same consciousness doesn't mean you can point to an identifying factor or set of factors that you did in the past that was immoral, because you're still trapped in the same epistemic uncertainty as everyone in the debate has acknowledged exists around morality. But more importantly, if you are indeed still conscious and the world is structured in a way that we take care of the consciousness of cows because in your previous life when you were in a position of power, you wanted to make the fate of cows generally better, then that just weakens tremendously the amount of punishment that this can have. There's a catch-22 here. The more continuity you can ascribe, the more likely it is that the world is going to be set up in a way such that there isn't actually a meaningful punishment to lower life forms. What did CG add to this? The first thing they added is, because we haven't shown that there is free will, it is as arbitrary. We disagree. The thing we have put in as the test for culpability is whether there is reason and reasoning, and that's the thing they didn't take into account in the response. More importantly, we would not punish someone who has absolutely no memory of a crime that was committed. For the exact same reason why in existing courts of law, we are very cautious to punish someone for reasons of, say, schizophrenia are completely separate from the person who committed a crime at the time. This seems incredibly consistent with every notion of justice in the justice system that we have. CG then says, but at least there are things like deterrence and rehabilitation. Those things are insufficient. Here is why. Because if you just cared about maximizing, say, rehabilitation in the justice system, you would think it is justified to lock someone up in a re-education camp if you thought there was a positive or significant chance that they will go on to commit a crime. That is not justified. And what is missing from that situation is they have not yet committed the crime. The element of retribution and accountability that comes from being able to assign the action to you and for you to realize that the punishment is because of the action you have taken is missing. So again, perhaps there are elements missing. What's crucial about culpability is what Darian tells you is crucial and isn't something that either team engages with. Last of all, they say randomness is not fair because it is less accurate, and at least on that side of the house, there is a greater relation to the actions you have already taken. I mean, accurate relative to what? The case we are making is that there should never be a relation at all because the moral relation doesn't track the moral significance or the continuity that happens. So when they say there is no relation, or we just think there is less relation. There isn't a relation between the person who is reborn, or a meaningful moral one, and the person who was in a previous life. And as a result, the fate of that person or the position in the lottery or where they end up living should not track as well. Why is this the most important issue in the round? It's the most important issue because it fundamentally affects the justice that underpins the entire world. It's literally enforcing a set of arbitrary punishments in the same way that any arbitrary force or government would if you are reborn in a situation where you cannot understand why you are in that position. How does this weigh up against the arguments from the Gov side? There are a few things I want to rebut here. The first is, I think, the strongest. There is now an overwhelming desire to do good. The first thing I want to note is it is not clear what the marginal change is. Many atheist people already think there is an inherent reason to be moral, that it is the right thing to do, even if, for instance, no one is watching. Where does this come about? It comes about potentially from sort of the social norms we live in or the moral education that our parents give us. So sure, now people are going to be expected to consider this sort of new situation they're going to be in, where it's not at all clear exactly what they should be doing in order to get there. It's not a significant increase in the amount of moral reasoning that most human beings already have. More importantly, and this is a significant bit, in the grand scheme of infinity, for instance, as Hamza concedes, if you do a terrible thing, you become an insect or a factory farm chicken for a lifetime, and then you reset to being a human being. If that is true, it seems infinitely more worthwhile to do hedonistic and evil things now, because in the grand scheme of infinity, the punishment of being an animal seems wildly insignificant. The thing about infinity is that the shorter the punishment is, or the more sort of sporadic that punishment is, and the fact that you can reset to being a human being again with no permanent consequence means that in the grand scheme of infinity, anything that isn't really that long just doesn't become a strong deterrent. I'll take opening government if they have one.
The strength of your extension and your primary rebuttal to us is built on a straw man of what karmic reincarnation is. For the reason that Darian gave, Hinduism doesn't preach punishing two different people. You are literally the same person. This is an utter straw man of what karmic reincarnation is.
But that is up for debate, right? Like the motion is there is now a new existence that is created. The question is, would we, by the standards we think define the criminal justice system and culpability, think that is a fair attribution? We, in closing opposition, think the answer isn't. The last thing I think of note in opening government is the fact that there's now significantly more care for animals and sympathy for the poor. Again, this is symmetric because, as opening opposition rightly point out, if you think you're going to be back via the birth lottery, you'll do things to minimize the effect of the birth lottery as well. But more importantly, I just don't think it's true that we sympathize with people who are being punished. We are more likely to say that an animal who is, say, in a factory farm is being justly treated if we do terrible things to them, because we human beings who are still human beings and have, by inference, done morally good things in the past, we deserve the goodness, and note this is the language of opening government, we deserve the goodness of being able to have cheap, like meat or whatnot, because we've done good things in the past. So existing immorality becomes framed as moral precisely because it is framed under it is sort of justice or deserts. I just don't think the world they create is significantly better, but what does happen in the world that exists in the government side is a world where millions of individuals just get punished for random arbitrary things or things that feel equally random or arbitrary. For these reasons, we're super proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition whip and all speakers for a phenomenal debate. So let's give them another round of applause. People on the stream are probably doing that, but you can't hear them. Know that they are there. Thank you so much, and we will get back to you with the results.